Hello, my name's Chris Dixon. I'm the Ocean Campaign Leader at the Environmental Investigation Agency, and I was asked to take us on a little bit of a tour of what happened at INC-3. So without further ado, I will just kick us straight off. So this slide is just to show where we are in the negotiations. So since the resolution was adopted early last year, we've had 3 rounds of negotiations, which brings us effectively to the midpoint in the negotiations. We had Uruguay, we had Paris, we've just had Nairobi, INC3, and then next year we'll be going to Ottawa in Canada and Busan in South Korea before concluding the negotiations by the end of next year and opening the agreement for adoption in 2025. Questions do remain about whether the timeline is still feasible, given how the negotiations are progressing. But for all intents and purposes, we're still working on the assumption that this is the timeline. So we're now in the final year of negotiations for a new plastics treaty. So I've just put this slide in as an example of two of the kind of framings that we saw at the meeting in Nairobi last month. So one was about the ghost of Paris, and that to me, what that means is what we saw in Paris was a bit of an explosion in terms of multilateralism. We saw divergent views from member states on some very key elements, such as rules of procedure, which is quite fundamental to how the negotiations are conducted. And so what happened is we lost a lot of negotiating time because of these divergent views and spent a lot of the meeting essentially in these kind of informal huddles where member states were trying to thrash out solutions and move forward in the negotiations. Whilst that was achieved, we did lose a lot of time. And so looking at the timeline and where we are now, there was a kind of call to invoke the Nairobi spirit when thinking about INC3. And I take this to mean the fact that the resolution itself was negotiated in Nairobi last year, and it was a really great example of multilateralism, cooperation, countries coming together to really forge a vision for an ambitious and effective plastics treaty. So as the INC3 meeting was being opened, there was this call, let's channel this spirit and try and have a productive negotiation. So, going into the meeting, there were a couple of really key objectives, which were then around these objectives was essentially how the meeting was structured. So the ideal outcomes of the meeting were really to achieve a first full reading of the zero draft text. The zero draft was basically the basis for the negotiations. It was the thing that we were working with, the main document, to get a mandate for a further or first draft of the text so that we could move forward to text-based negotiations. So right now, the zero draft is basically a compilation of ideas with options in it, and states aren't really able to actually negotiate text, the should, the shall, etc., because we're still working really with a compilation of ideas. And then the other thing that was really important was to get a mandate for intersessional work. So intersessional work is the work that happens between meetings, and it ensures that states are then able to have more substantive conversation, exchange views, and really advance ideas before just getting into the negotiating room. There were some threats to achieving these outcomes. One is the fact that the rules of procedure issue wasn't fully resolved in INC2. So there was this thing called an interpretive statement, which was agreed as a kind of placeholder, but it's not a permanent solution to the issue around voting rights, for example. So there was always a risk that rules of procedure would come back again as a topic at INC3. There was a concern that the zero draft might not be accepted as the basis for negotiations. The zero draft is developed from what happened at INC2 and the submission processes from member states. But because there wasn't a lot of negotiating time at INC2, there was a risk that perhaps member states would feel like the text didn't really reflect all of the views of everybody participating in the negotiations. There was also a concern about this idea that the kind of one-day meeting on scope and principles could spill over into the negotiations and hold things up. So that some member states might say that we're not going to start negotiating until we've resolved the question of what is the scope of the instrument. So that was a risk. And then finally, this concern that there might be a flurry of inputs and new ideas, new text for the zero draft, which means that the text that states are working with becomes extremely bloated and very difficult to work with. So what happened then? So There were actually two full readings of the zero draft across three contact groups. So the work was divided into what's called contact groups. So one was dealing with the kind of core substantive obligations of the treaty. The second was looking at implementation measures, so things like financing, national implementation plans, that kind of thing. And then the third was really everything else. So it was a bucket to capture the conversations about things that weren't discussed at INC-2 and intersessional work. These groups weren't all happening in parallel, but they were happening throughout the week in different formulations. There was an initial refusal to accept the zero draft as the basis for negotiations, but this didn't really go anywhere, so it wasn't a substantive threat actually to the overall functioning of the meeting, and the work was ultimately completed throughout the week. There were some delays and walkouts over scope and principles and general sort of reflection of views amongst member states, but again, these were mostly resolved and the work was able to be completed. On the other risk, well, there were over 400 submissions made during the negotiations, which means that the revised draft is now over 100 pages long. On the one hand, this means that it's a huge amount of text to be working with. It's going to be very difficult to refine this into something coherent to have as the basis for negotiations at INC4. But on the other hand, the fact that at this meeting, really there was the opportunity for every member state to have their voice heard. And we saw many of the, for example, like high ambition countries taking more of a backseat to allow space for others to hear their, to share their views and air those views and make text submissions. So I think at the kind of closing out of this meeting, we can certainly say that every group of member states has had their chance to express their view on what should go in the plastics treaty. So hopefully that can put us in good stead moving forward. I guess another point that's worth mentioning is that we did see the emergence of a kind of alternative to the high ambition coalition, which was a group of like-minded countries, including, for example, Iran, Russia, and China, who are kind of proposing a different view for what the treaty should involve, with more of a focus on downstream interventions. So, what were the outcomes then of INC3, bearing all of that in mind? So, firstly, there is a mandate for the incoming chair to synthesize and revise the treaty draft. So, as you may be aware, we have a new chair from Ecuador who's going to be chairing the next phase of the negotiations. It's not a mandate for a first draft, but it is a kind of updated version of the text that we have right now. Unfortunately, though, there was no agreement on formal intersessional work, which does leave us in a bit of a precarious position going forward, because there are some very substantive issues on things like, for example, primary plastic production, on chemicals and polymers of concern, where there was big support for advancing these conversations and evolving and sharing views on these, but now no mandate to have those conversations continuing in a formal way intersessionally. Other topics also got interest, like fishing gear, for example, reuse, product design. So states are now going to be left to their own devices to think about ways to progress those conversations informally, but ensuring that there's broad participation, equitable participation, and so on. But without the kind of formal support of the structure of the INC Secretariat. So that is a less than ideal outcome. Other things, just to kind of wrap up on the digest. So I mentioned that there was the emergence of this new like-minded group of countries, which garnered a lot of media coverage throughout the week and was something certainly that got everyone thinking about what this means for kind of the future scope of the instrument, what it might entail, and how the negotiations are going to play out over the next year. There was also quite a lot of media coverage around the fact that there were a huge volume of fossil fuel lobbyists at the negotiations. So we're starting to see those corporate lobbyists taking a much more active interest in the negotiations and participating in them. There was some interesting discussions, for example, a side event on conflict of interest policies to sort of think about, what does this mean, especially looking at, the COP negotiations happening in parallel and many of the sort of similar actors involved there. What does this mean really for the effectiveness of the plastics treaty? We saw the civil society and rights holder movement being extremely active, from holding a demonstration in Nairobi to participation in side events, organizing events for Indigenous peoples, really bringing a very broad stakeholder view to the negotiations, and as observers ensuring that this global community of civil society and rights holders are the watchdogs of these negotiations. And then We also saw other stakeholder groups like the investor community showing interest and writing a letter to the High Ambition Coalition governments in advance of INC-3 to kind of really push for that effective and ambitious direction for the negotiations. And we also saw the Scientists Coalition being incredibly active and kind of pushing for. As also pushing for an ambitious plastics treaty and that really relies on science that's free from conflict of interest and is robust. So that is a whistle stop tour of INC3. Happy to answer any questions in the chat. Bye.